Hello everyone, welcome to the Atlas of Living Australia's webinar, How Biosecurity Data are Protecting Australia's Ecosystems. We're grateful to have people joining in from across the country to hear from several of Australia's biosecurity experts on how they're using data to monitor and reduce the threat of pests in Australia. Before we begin, I'd like to acknowledge that I'm joining from the lands of the Turrbal and Yagara people and acknowledge their elders past and present. I also extend that to the traditional owners of all the lands you're joining us from today and acknowledge any Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islanders joining us right now. The Atlas of Living Australia is Australia's biodiversity data infrastructure. We house more than 150 million occurrence records. But one of the features of the ALA is our biosecurity alert service, where we use species occurrence records to alert biosecurity authorities across the country to potential invasive species being detected. That's why we're thrilled to have our panelists joining us today as they'll explore the work they're doing to support and protect Australia from invasive species. I'll shortly hand over to our panelists to give a short presentation on their work, and then we'll save plenty of time at the end to answer your questions. If you have any questions, please use the question function to type it in, and our panelists will do their best to answer them in the second half of the webinar. At the end of the session, there will also be a quick poll with a few questions. That'd be really great if you could fill in before you drop off the call. So to kick us off, I'll hand over to Jens and David, who work on the national scale data integration and mapping of invasive species distributions in Australia. It's a collaboration between ABARES and the CSIRO. Jens Royce will be talking about his work on national scale invasive species distribution mapping with David from ABARES as well. Thanks, Jen and David. Over to you.
Awesome. So first, I'd like to acknowledge that we are really representing a team of collaborators from across ABARES and CSIRO listed here. And I'm going to give you some context and highlight key achievements of our research before my colleague David from ABARES will talk you through a published case study. I'd also like to acknowledge the Turrbal and Jagera peoples of Brisbane Meanjin, as well as the traditional custodians of all land and sea across Australia. So why do we need national scale invasive species distribution maps? And when I say maps, I don't mean just printed pictures, but also the underpinning spatial information in the form of GIS data layers. Well, information on the location, abundance and overall extent of invasive species populations is sought after by diverse stakeholders, by policymakers to support evidence-based decisions about monitoring and management investments across jurisdictional boundaries, by practitioners as a communication and engagement tool, as maps are quite accessible to land managers and lay audiences alike, or by researchers as an input into their models or analyses. So there are different approaches to generating such broad-scale spatial information. In Australia, gridded maps for many priority invasive plants and animals have been produced based on expert surveys. These are really useful, but they're also coarse and with limited transparency and robustness because the evidence base of the underpinning expert judgments are unknown. Alternatively, one could draw on the huge amount of field observations that are continuously collected and aggregated in important national infrastructures such as the Atlas of Living Australia or also Feral Scan, and display these data directly or in the form of hotspot maps. Or one could use them in a statistical species distribution model, which basically relates species observations to environmental characteristics so that predictions in unsampled areas can be made. Nowadays, there are user-friendly tools to fit such models, for example, in the biosecurity commons or eco-commons platforms, and even in the ALA itself. Ultimately, all data-driven approaches rely on good data coverage, and they treat all observations basically the same. So fortunately for the strengths of our biosecurity system, but unfortunately for researchers like us wanting to utilize our biosecurity data, in Australia, management of invasive species is a shared responsibility. This map from the National Feral Pig Action Plan website illustrates the diversity of stakeholders involved in pig management, from levels of government to agricultural, indigenous, and conservation land managers. And data is often collected as part of management programs. Add specific monitoring and survey activities by R&D providers, and you get an inherently fragmented national data set that is in fact not at all the same, and as it has been collected by different people at different places and times in fundamentally different ways. By no means all of these data sources find their way into the ALA, and in fact often remain quite inaccessible for various reasons, ranging from just difficult to find and access to not yet published or sensitive and never to be published. So those field observations that are in the ALA are mostly so-called presence-only data. So basically points on a map that show where and when a species has been observed, which are pretty easy to collect and aggregate, but they have problems. The biggest one is that they do not tell us whether the absence of a data point means that the species isn't there, or simply that it hasn't been recorded, which needs someone to go there, detect the species, record the observation, and upload it to the ALA. Or conversely, whether a lot of data points reflect high species abundance or just intensive recording activity. This is where survey data comes in. And these are often not in the ALA, or if they are, with much of their valuable information removed. Presence-absent survey data tell us exactly what area was searched, the red squares in this picture, and whether the species was detected or not detected. We know that all other areas were not searched. And abundance absent survey data give us extra information about how many individuals, if any, were detected. So wouldn't it be nice to be able to use all these data sources and the different broad and fine scale information they contain while accounting for their differences to generate robust, data-driven and nationally consistent maps about the current distribution of invasive species? So that's what we did in the National Vertebrate Pests and Weeds Distribution Project. And we utilized a relatively new statistical method, integrated species distribution models, short ISDMs, to do it. We developed and published a software package called RISDOM that provides streamlined access to ISDMs. Without going into the detail of its inner workings, as summarized in this figure from our paper, the species distribution is modeled as a spatial point process, which integrates over different data models that describe how this distribution was observed. And the point is to leverage strengths and minimize limitations from each data type. So essentially, information about sampling effort and species abundance from survey data is used to correct for bias in presence-only data, and information about current distribution patterns across the species range in Australia from presence-only data is used to overcome the limited coverage of expensive survey data. So over the past few years, we applied this method to several priority invasive pest animals and weeds. In the process, we've discovered and integrated large amounts of public and privately held invasive species data sources. One map and spatial data set on the current distribution of feral pigs in Australia has been published, as shown here. Several others are in the pipeline with our colleagues from ABARES, including on feral deer distributions. We've developed reusable workflows to enable consistent application across multiple species. And the approach is beginning to be used more broadly, well beyond the invasive species domain, including by the National Koala Monitoring Program. We've also learned some things. Foremost, that national scale data integration is quite an involved and complex process, as you'll hear from David in a minute. It's not only technically and statistically challenging, but also requires navigating institutional barriers to data sharing and building commitment and confidence among data providers and species experts alike. So there's definitely still a place for simpler out-of-the-box tools, such as the biosecurity commons, where the benefits of integrated modeling do not justify its costs, And the final message I want to leave you with is that systematically collected survey data have been crucial because of the information about sampling effort, species detectability, and species abundance they may contain. But at the same time, a presence-only data set that is as comprehensive as possible is invaluable to provide the necessary coverage. So thanks to the Atlas of Living Australia for providing that. With that, over to David.
Thanks, Jens. As he said, I'm going to get into a bit of a worked case study focusing on pigs to kind of show how the data is aggregated and used. So this is roughly what our workflow looks like from beginning to end, starting with acquiring and processing the data, building in the ecological knowledge, and then the models. And in turn, obviously things are far less linear than this. Things are happening in parallel and feeding into each other in various ways, but I think it's a good way to think about it, especially when putting into slides. So as Jens just touched on, ALA is a really valuable resource for public data, but a lot of data isn't public for various reasons, including privacy concerns. And it's just very unevenly, it can be very unevenly distributed across Australia. And I want you to kind of focus on the Kimberley as we flick through some of these slides, because I think this is a good example. Atlases also lead to some degradation of the data. You lose those absence records and the methodological information that goes with it, which can be really valuable when you want to build informative models. So we went to stakeholders across all the states and territories, both the environment and agriculture departments, and built a memorandum of understanding for sharing data and with us, with the view to build these models. And then there's also other ancillary data that's come in from other sources with time. And then we really wanted to document what was there in detailed fashion. So the spatial and temporal extent, as well as things like the sampling design can be very important, which is before you've even stepped foot in the field, where you're looking and why. And then the methods that might affect the probability of seeing the pig given its presence even. So various aerial transects versus camera traps, etc. And the size of the actual area you're looking at is also very important information. So for instance, the strip width, and then other information such as reliability of identification, so the experience of the observer on the ground, and also making sure we're keeping track of those privacy conditions that were stipulated for the use. Together, this is the feral pig data we pulled together. And on the left, you can see these are macropod surveys that cover a lot of area and give us good count data of how many pigs were seen on the ground. And there's two different methods that tend to get used, the fixed wing and the helicopter survey. And we separate those in the model to just kind of, the helicopters are flying slower and lower so they can see more pigs than the fixed wing, for instance. Similarly, we've got camera trapping and more fixed wing aerial surveys in the presence absence. So that's just yes, no, the animal was seen at a given location. And then we've also got this presence only, which is the Atlas data that we're talking about. And it's important here to understand in an area where you're not seeing occurrences, is that because pigs aren't occurring or that observers aren't occurring? And I'll get back to that in a moment. This is all combined with good ecological knowledge of what's going on and its introduction history. And it can be, the introduction history can be important, and we need to understand where we should perhaps be removing observations such as Kangaroo Island, where they were locally extirpated, and also old absence records in those macropod surveys can go back decades. So you can have lots of absence records, but now they've been colonized, so they'd be misleading if you'd already included them. So you want to know how much you're keeping and not deleting too much data either, because you want to keep as much information as possible. Then you've also got what's actually driving the distribution, and this can be things like forage availability, physiological stresses such as maximum temperature, water availability, etc. The things that are limiting their distribution and perhaps even driving the spread. We haven't touched on it yet. There's also a spatial random effect that helps us pull back from everywhere that they could or suitably occur to where they actually are in Australia. And while the ecological knowledge isn't directly used in the model here, it is good to have good understanding of where to expect them. Sorry, what to expect those parameters to look like. I won't get into detail on them. So back to where people are, where observers are present versus where pigs are present. This is another place where ALA has been really valuable, and especially the Galar package. We've taken down every mammalian pest species record that we can see to get an idea of, okay, if you're seeing a goat at a location, you'd probably also tell us if you were seeing a pig at that location. So it's a good proxy for where people are looking as distinct from where they're present. There's 30 odd mammalian pests in Australia, so it would be really cumbersome without a package like Galar. And then when you're talking about weeds instead, you're talking about hundreds of species, and it would be completely a non-starter if I had to go through those individually. Pull those together, and Jens already showed you this map, but this is what we end up getting, and we get this estimate of relative abundance, which is, it's not saying there are 100 pigs in those greenest locations, but rather there's more pigs there than there are in the yellow locations and so on. It's all relative spatially to each other. It's a method that also gives us the uncertainty estimates around those. And we've really focused on making sure that we've got reproducible workflows. I won't get into the actual coding of these models. For those who are interested, there's a manuscript coming out soon. There's also quite a bit of information in the metadata that's attached to these outputs, which these QR codes will lead you to. This whole project is really being facilitated by buy-in from states and territories, and they've been given feedback at all stages of the project, and they'd also been given drafts of these models, of earlier versions of these models to view, which led us to make edits at pretty much all stages of the workflow that I've just kind of laid out. We tweaked the covariates, we removed some outliers, we targeted some data that were previously missing, and it really helped us build models that we were comfortable with and we're doing a reasonable job on the ground. Together we've built what we hope are credible national maps of the distribution of pigs that are comparable across state and territory boundaries, and we're hoping will facilitate further research, whether that's disease and impact spread modeling, threatened species overlays we've been talking about with some people, disease risks, and so forth, as well as public engagement tools. And we've really discussed with our stakeholders how to make these fit for these purposes. I've managed to wrap up a slight bit early. I will leave some acknowledgements on the screen as we hand over.
Thanks, David and Jens. That's really great to see that work and really interesting. Going to hand over now to Steve from Biosecurity Queensland. Steve's going to be talking to us about how he's been using the ALA Biosecurity Alert System and iNaturalist for best pest surveillance and detection in Queensland. Over to you, Steve.
Thanks, Andrew. I'll just try to share my screen. Hang on a sec. Hopefully you can see that okay. So yeah, finding the needle in the haystack. Biosecurity, one of the challenges of biosecurity is this concept of early detection. So much like dealing with skin cancer, your best hope is to detect that cancer early and eliminate it. So we try to do the same thing with potentially invasive species. So there's a whole, most people will know, there's plenty of pests in Queensland already, cane toads, feral cats, feral pigs, lantana, you name it, there's hundreds. But very few people are aware that there's loads more that could invade in the future. So we've got a very narrow window of opportunity. If we can detect those potentially invasive species when they first arrive in their early stages of spread, we do have an opportunity to completely eliminate them. And we have done that for a number of targets already. So the mission objective, if you like, is to keep doing that for a whole heap of more. We've got a priority list. We've got a pretty good idea of what we believe are the future threats, and the challenge before us is to detect those things before it's too late. So that's when the whole INAT ALA biosecurity alert system comes in. So quick acknowledgements, obviously Andrew Turley and the CSIRO team, and also everyone at ALA, Australian Government, and also obviously iNaturalist, which is the platform or the app that I'll talk a fair bit about. So yeah, what is it, this iNaturalist ALA alert system? I would rank it as one of our best, if not the best, state level surveillance tools that we have. We've got another one that we call the Weed Spotters Network, which is a trained group of 1,900 volunteers across the state that are on the lookout for weeds in particular. But the ALA INAT alert system is probably, arguably, our most comprehensive surveillance tool. So Andrew has set up a automated weekly alert, just basically an email that comes to me whenever one of our high-risk targets is detected on ALA, and as you know, iNaturalist data feeds into ALA. So whenever one of our targets is detected, that alert comes through to me for actioning. So the beauty of, well, iNaturalist in particular, it's growing rapidly. It's got 19,000 users in Queensland alone, 135,000 across Australia, and that number is growing really quickly. Data from iNaturalist feeds into ALA. So when people use iNaturalist, they're looking for any animal and plant, not necessarily invasive, but anything. So I'll talk a little bit about why they're doing that. So they're almost capturing invasive species by default. But anyway, we're capitalising on that. So the beauty or the strength of iNaturalist is it is harnessing the popularity of mobile phones. You know, this has never happened before. Literally anyone with a mobile phone, they can take a photo of any animal and plant or fungus. They can load it into INAT, which is primarily an identification tool. Obviously, you know, if they find something that is of biosecurity concern, well, that triggers the alert system. So, you know, thanks to iNaturalist, we've now got thousands of eyes on the ground. We've never had that before. So this is a real step, a huge step forward in terms of surveillance and detecting new invasive species. So maybe we can now find the needle in the haystack. Obviously, Queensland is a vast place, but 19,000 people out there looking for stuff helps a lot. So I have very little doubt. I've been using the alert system for a while now. I've got very little doubt that it has improved the probability of early detection of extreme risk targets, you know, stuff that we don't have yet. Once those targets, and I'll talk about a couple in a minute, once they're detected, they are actioned by our operational staff working with local governments and others. So some results to proof that this is actually working. Just in the last year alone, we've had numerous Opuntia detections. So Opuntia are really high-risk cactus species that we're very concerned about, pose huge threats to the arid and semi-arid zone of Queensland and Australia generally. However, the two biggest detections in terms of significance would be cyan weed and also the freshwater gold clam. Unfortunately, the freshwater gold clam, despite being a great detection, first one for Queensland, first one for Australia, subsequent delimitation by our operational staff have shown that the feasibility of actually doing something is really poor. Unfortunately, the clam has already spread over a significant length of the Brisbane River. So obviously you can't go and poison the upper reaches of the Brisbane River and get rid of it. So you're really limited what you can do. But the good news, cyan weed, you can do something about that. This is a photo of the actual iNaturalist detection. Someone, not one of our staff, just a random member of the public, noticed this plant flowering, took a photo, loaded onto iNaturalist. The onboard AI gave a tentative ID, and then subsequently the experts got on board and confirmed the ID. Once that's confirmed, it flicks to research grade, the little green flag, and that then triggers the alert system. So literally within a week, I get an alert that thing's been detected. we are on the lookout for it. First detection in southeast Queensland. That advice got forwarded straight on to our operational staff for southeast. They then contacted Moreton Bay Regional Council. Council guys went out, I think, in the following week, killed all the plants, had a good look around, couldn't find any more. They will monitor the site, obviously, going forward, but at this point in time, we believe that that incursion's been eliminated. We are investigating where it came from, but anyway, detected, gone. It's as simple as that. So outstanding success story there. Siam weed, just a bit of context, I would consider it the next lantana. Its impact is very similar, if not the same, as lantana. It is well established in North Queensland, hence there's that propagule pressure into central and southern Queensland. It is one of the world's worst weeds. It dominates, this is a photo from North Queensland, it dominates bushland, replaces other plants, obviously has a big agricultural impact as well because it invades pasture. So potentially tens of $1 million per annum impact you're looking at in southeast Queensland if it got going. So right now we've got a chance to keep this out, and if we've got decent surveillance, there's no reason why this stuff should ever really get going. Quickly, there's a shot of the freshwater golden clam, tiny little thing. It's amazing that someone noticed it. It's very similar to a native clam, but not so successful in terms of an actual response. But anyway, just it's proof of concept that it was detected, a very cryptic target. Also, I'll give a plug for the nil detections. People do tend to dismiss zero or nil detections. They are really important from a biosecurity point of view. And there is a tendency for people to count the number of significant detections as a metric of success. You know, that is important, but nil detections is also, or does have value as well. Our targets are rare, very rare, you know, literally needle in a haystack type stuff. So just getting one detection per annum is actually a really good outcome. And that's probably all you're going to do. You're not going to get dozens. They're just not out there. So the important point I want to make is nil detections provide confidence of what we call proof of freedom, that an area is free of a particular target. And that's really important in terms of confirming absence and also the validity of the current targets. Obviously, if we were detecting a target every second day, it wouldn't be a very good target for a detection. It means it's here and it's widespread. So the fact that we're not seeing large numbers of detections means that they're really good targets. They're probably still absent, and the window of opportunity for early detection is probably still there. Quick plug for INAT. I think whoever wrote it, it was privately designed system. It was genius. They have incentivized people to look for all animals and plants and fungi, anything. Doesn't have to be invasive, can be anything. And they produced this, well, it's actually a top 500 leaderboard. I've just got a screenshot of the top 10. So it effectively incentivizes, and it turns it into a competition. It counts how many species you've found. And I, for one, are totally addicted to it. Takes advantage of the whole, you know, hunter instinct, I suppose, and that whole competitive thing. So it's very clever the way it's done it. The other things it does, it's a really good learning opportunity. You learn about what species in your area. You can actually use it to find species because it's got GPS, etc., to locate species. It's got enormous functionality. It's fantastic. I could go on and on about that. Just in terms of some risks quickly, because my time's up, it is a non-government platform. We don't have any control over it. It is self-funded, so it could fall over, but provided everyone uses it, which I think they are, I don't see why it shouldn't keep going. That's it. Thank you.
Thanks so much for that, Steve. So we're going to move on now into the question and answer section of it. We got plenty of time, so I'll try and get to everyone's questions that have actually come in. But I'm going to start with one for Jens and David. We've had C. Adams ask around, how did you deal with false negatives? Any thoughts on integrating or how useful integrating, and sorry, this is the second part of the question, and thoughts on integrating or how useful integration of eDNA technology, given the extensive eDNA sampling that is going on in Australia.
Who do you want to throw it to, either of us, or?
Whoever feels most confident to address the question. Why don't you go, Jens?
Yeah, so I guess, I mean, maybe first starting with, so how do you deal, the kind of two separate questions. How do you deal with false negatives? Yeah, so this is basically around survey data where the observation says there's an absence, but the absence is due to the species just not having been detected by whatever the method is. So in our modeling approach, this is probably quite technically involved, so I'm not going to go into much detail, but we sort of account for relative differences between, like what David touched on, relative differences in species detectability between different survey methods. And so the model allows for differences between different data sets, however we define these. For example, we said that the detectability between fixed wing and helicopter surveys is different, likewise with camera trapping versus aerial surveys. But ultimately, some of these data are also collected in a way that allows us to directly infer species detectability and model that. So we haven't really specifically accounted for species detectability information specifically in our models, but it is a possibility to do that. And I know that in other applications of the method where such data are integrated, that is done. Without running over time and answering the question here, just with regards to the eDNA question, I also have a comment. So to me, that kind of falls into the same bucket as a lot of other remote or autonomous new sensing technologies, like also drones, camera trapping, acoustic sensing, and integrating data from these methods is absolutely useful because that basically lowers the cost of collecting survey data, and inherently many of these methods do contain information about the observation process itself, including what area was searched, where the sensors were placed, and what the features of the sensing method are in terms of detecting species. So yes, these are very valuable, and I think will become more valuable into the future. The challenge is for researchers to consistently process such data and make it available on platforms that are accessible by others to then use the data in downstream analyses like our modeling. That is sort of the big challenge, but again, there are initiatives out there in all of these sensing-based technologies that aim to aggregate the data, and I believe the ALA is involved in many of them as well in making the data available. I leave it at that. Thanks.
Thanks, Jens. Steve, do you mean to have your hand up?
Yeah, I was just going to add, if I understand the question correctly, yeah, this issue of false negative is it's a big issue in biosecurity. And it all boils down to level of confidence. You know, how confident are you that something is either absent or present? And we wrestle with this all the time because you'll never have a really high level of confidence. That spectre of the false negatives is always looming large. So I mean, that's where it comes down to the capacity and the sensitivity of your surveillance system. the better the surveillance, the higher the level of confidence, and the less likely the false negatives are to be there. But it's always there. And at the end of the day, these targets are going to keep coming anyway. So we don't get too hung up on that issue, because the challenge is to do your best with the resources you've got, throw everything at it, try to maximize the probability of detection, keeping in mind that you're never going to be 100% certain that something's there or not. I don't know if that answers the question, but just want to make that point. Thanks.
No, thanks, Steve and Jens. Another question here, and I'll throw this one to Steve, and it's a little bit curly, but so comment here that iNaturalist and ALA are fantastic resources for biosecurity surveillance. One consideration is that people upload observations of suspected invasive species to iNaturalist, but don't complete their biosecurity obligations by reporting the suspected species directly to local biosecurity agencies. The question is, how can iNaturalist or ALA encourage observers to send their suspected reports to biosecurity agencies? Is there anything, I guess, framing that, is there anything you think that could be done better to make that connection?
Yeah, it is a tricky question. I mean, the simple act of putting it on iNaturalist does bring it to our attention. I mean, I spend quite a bit of time monitoring all the observations even before they go research grade and trigger the alert. So there's a very good chance we'll detect it anyway. And I do regular searches for things as well. So, so in terms of meeting the people's obligation, I mean, yes, if you, as soon as you have a reasonable belief that you found a prohibited biosecurity matter, yeah, you're supposed to notify us. But you know, we accept that that's a big ask, and we're not going to, you know, we're not going to start prosecuting people for not, you know, for doing something that's you know unreasonable. So it's all about doing what you can, putting it onto iNat. That is, we're very happy if people can just do simply that. Download iNat, be aware that it is a surveillance platform amongst other things, and just be aware that you know that's probably the best and simplest and easiest way to bring things to our attention. We don't expect anything more than that.
Wonderful, thanks, Steve. There's a couple of questions here that I'm actually going to address that have come in more broadly around ALA. So one of them here is there a risk of locations of sensitive species being exposed with iNaturalist? If so, do you know how this is mitigated? So one of the roles of ALA as the Australian node is we actually provide a list of sensitive species to iNaturalist, and those locations are obfuscated within iNaturalist before it even comes to the ALA as well. So those lists come from, it's an amalgamation of different state and territory lists that are held by various environmental departments of various names across Australia and the state and territory. And we manage that sort of process and that connection with iNaturalist to make sure that we don't have sensitive species, mainly threatened species. Well, I think it's all threatened species actually being released as well. Next question here. It's probably one back for you, Steve, around what do you do publicly to try and encourage the public to get involved in using iNaturalist to help with invasive species detection? The user commented that it makes a really big difference if that feedback and those connections can be done and communication. So yeah, over to you.
Yeah. Well, we're a bit limited in our reach to the media. But anyway, our main strategy, I suppose, is to promote the alert system wherever we can, primarily through our weed spotters network, because we've taken a very targeted approach. We've got 1,900 volunteers signed up for the weed spotters network, and they're all people that are out in the field and they do have an interest and a passion in this type of thing. So we used to target like a scattergun approach, the public generally and landholders, and we found that just doesn't work. They're not the people that are going to notice this stuff. So it's generally people who are into it. You know, they are interested in animals and plants. They're the ones that are going to find it. So as part of all our promotional work, we do regular training workshops. Got a monthly newsletter that goes out to the 1900 weed spotter volunteers. We do what we can to just remind people to use iNaturalist as well. And every talk we give it a plug. And yeah, we're pretty confident the message is getting through. Yeah, I think it is working. But yeah, I mean, the bottom line, we do what we can to promote it. The media is difficult to wrangle. We have limitations as to what we can say. But yeah, it's very targeted, and we target local government, national parks, people that do have an interest in invasive species primarily.
Wonderful, thanks, Steve. I've got another question here. So this one's probably best directed towards Jens and David, and it's coming in from Andrew Cox about sort of how can the ALA, or I think sort of the data in the ALA, be used for measuring performance of global targets? So Australia recently signed up to a protocol where we're trying to reduce invasive species by 50% by 2030. And just wondering if there's anything in your work that could help the departments actually be able to measure that as a baseline initially and go towards that.
So currently we're not getting to population estimates, so I'd be reticent to say that we can really say you've reduced, I don't know, rabbits or pigs even by 50%. They're reasonable maps of the area. So if you're measuring in terms of area, it's also good to probably direct you where to be looking, and forming sampling designs around how things are changing over time, but without improving both the modeling approach and the data that's coming in to some degree to better cover it with the higher quality data sets. I'd be reticent to say we can do too much to really be tracking it, although it is a morsel of information in the broader picture. Anything to add, Jens?
Yeah, I can only add that I guess in terms of these international targets towards limiting and tracking our response to incursions and biosecurity issues, the distribution of species is just one element. There's various indicators that are being developed, proposed, and measured, and the ALA sort of location information that is contained and translated into spatial information using techniques such as ours is certainly can inform some information around the extent of invasive species, but there's many important other dimensions around invasive species impacts and pathways of introduction that are probably more prominent in terms of what I guess the key difference what we're talking about here is David and we're working with established widespread established invasive species. Steve is very much concerned about exotic or emerging invasive species, and often these international targets are aimed at the preventative aspects, because that is ultimately a very important function of the biosecurity system.
Thanks, David and Jens. Just going to address a couple of questions. There's a few coming in with a couple of themes. So there's been some questions around feral scan and weed scan, so the various KISS apps that come in, and whether they connect with the ALA. Yes, they do connect with the ALA, the data comes in. There are some restrictions around that. So there's some species that are sensitive. So an example of that is feral deer data. it can be sensitive because people using that for hunting and illegally entering private property. So that data doesn't come into the ALA, but if people contacted KISS directly, if they were doing research, I am sure that they would go about finding ways to share that data with you as well. There's also a few questions that have come in around funding for various citizen science platforms and apps. So iNaturalist, and recognising that Nature Mapper in Canberra is closing down soon as well. So the ALA doesn't support funding for any of those particular apps. As Steve sort of addressed, iNaturalist is completely independent. It's basically the equivalent of an NGO based over in America. And although the ALA is the node for iNaturalist in Australia, essentially our extent is providing them with things like the sensitive species list. And if there's Australia centric questions that they have, they'll come to us. And we also have those contacts if there's a problem coming in, we need to change or fix something. So that's sort of the role we play. There's no financial transactions associated with that at all. Just having a look back through the questions here as well. We did have a question around fire ants that I might turn to Steve as well. There was a user, Greg, who was wondering if there's any way for him to get notifications of fire ant detections in his email or in his inbox. Are there any systems set up in Biosecurity Queensland to communicate that to the public?
Not that I'm aware of. I'd probably suggest he contact the fire ant people directly, just to see what sort of mechanism. Yeah, I've never actually heard that request before. I can see some merit in it. So
yeah, I know that the fire ant program, they published maps of different areas and restrictions. I think they'd be a good analogue of where fire ants are expected to be found and where they're not as well.
yeah.
Another question here, so it's a little bit broad, but they're wondering about using different sensing techniques to direct operations, so whether it's eradication or surveillance and that. And are there other sort of new emerging technologies that are being used and being found helpful for the detection of different invasive species here? So the questioner has used that night vision can be used helpful for foxes. So I'll throw it open as a general question. Are there new and emerging technologies that are finding value for the detection of invasive species?
Yep, I can have a crack at that one. There's a few, and they're pretty exciting. The main one would be aerial photography from a drone. But well, we've been doing that for a long time, but the exciting bit is linking that to onboard AI or processing the images using AI. We've got one of our ops guys up north that's doing some really good work detecting a plant called Cecropia, grows in the rainforest, and they're using drones to take images and then process the images using AI to detect the actual target. And it's really conspicuous. It's potentially saving us a small fortune in, historically we do on-ground foot-based surveillance, slogging through the rainforest looking for things, but now we can go to the air for that target and detect it. And the application of that is huge. I know I'm pretty sure fire ants were dabbling in a similar thing using aerially mounted thermal cameras. I don't know the latest of where they're at with that. But yeah, that's one form of surveillance. There are others. eDNA came along. We all got excited over that at the start. It does have some application for certain targets that are detectable. And again, you have the spectre of the false negatives where, there's some critical threshold where that eDNA in a water body becomes detectable. Obviously if it's at very low levels, you're not gonna find it. If it's one red-eared slider turtle in Lake Wivenhoe, you're probably not going to find it using eDNA, but it is something you can look at, and we do use it for exotic fish and other things, and we're looking at it for detection of Asian spine toad, which is the next cane toad. We have, or KISS has looked at that. I don't know where that's at. Someone's doing a PhD into that. There are other forms of surveillance like the acoustic traps we deploy for detection of Asian spine toads at strategic ports along the eastern Australian coastline. The trap is a cage trap. It plays the call of the male Asian spine toad in a little computer black box and attracts the females in, and that's the theory. We haven't caught any yet, but we have those set in place as sentinel sites, early warning systems. We use flying fox camps as sentinel sites for detection of plants that we know are dispersed by flying foxes, so Myconia and Cecropia in particular. We regularly survey underneath those flying fox camps, looking for those specific targets. They're the more, I guess, high-tech sort of forms of surveillance. Apart from that, we do, as I say, INAT, weed scan, feral scan, the weed spotter networks would be 99% of our surveillance capability and capacity. That's it, purely because of the numbers. This is the numbers game. The more people looking, the higher the probability of detection, I think. So I hope that answers the question.
No, that's really good, Steve. Jens, did you have any perspectives on this?
Just really briefly to add to this, yeah, absolutely. So I've heard research around using eDNA in the aquatic weed space as well, very useful for the purpose of detecting a species, like early detection, like positive identification, where in areas that are otherwise very, very difficult to sample using any other methods. And so I think there's a vast array of other methods, like at CSIRO, we're also working on optical X-ray or pheromone trapping of pests, agricultural pests, for the purpose of detection. Other methods, so I think there's a lot of opportunities there. The methods to apply for more monitoring of species density and things like that, of more established invasive species, you would use different techniques, camera trapping, drone surveillance, as well as acoustic monitoring are definitely emerging options there. So I just want to make that distinction really of different technologies being useful for the detection versus the monitoring aspects.
Yeah, that's a good point, that the surveillance technique really is taxa specific. It depends what you're trying to look at. And yeah, like there's enormous scope for innovation. There really is. Like some of the stuff they're doing with the Asian bees and using the rainbow bead as a detection tool was pretty amazing. So yeah, there's enormous scope, and it's limited probably by resourcing and funding to really fully utilize it. That's a constant barrier that we hit.
Wonderful. Thanks, Steve and Jens, for answering that one. Another question here from Jonathan. It's touching on the nature repair market. So the question is, do the presenters have any thoughts about the integration of these tools with the nature repair market, such as NRM projects that are being certified on the basis of removing feral animals and weeds from areas? Are there concerns about incentives to demonstrate a biosecurity threat exists and then later the management or removal of it? So is anyone here actually familiar with the nature repair market and any of the protocols that might go into them?
Nope, sorry.
Broadly, a good answer.
Sorry, go ahead, David.
Yeah, you go, David.
Sorry, I said not adequately to give a good answer.
Yeah, so broadly familiar, but I think that goes well beyond sort of a data question. Yeah, so sorry, I can't give
No, that's
good answer in
okay.
direct relation to our
I think we're too specialized. Yep.
Got lots of opinions, but don't necessarily want to say now.
From what I'm aware of, there's currently protocols being written by DQ for applying for nature repair market and getting the credits for that. I don't believe there is currently actually published one for removing invasive species. I think it's mainly about planting new plants, but I also believe that DQ is looking at bringing in these new protocols that could be used for getting credits for it as well. So until those protocols come out, it's probably hard to say too much about it, about what could be done there. So
just one point I will make, the whole concept, eliminating an invasive species from an area is generally really difficult. It's an ongoing thing. You have to be willing to invest, well, if it's an established thing, permanently, because it's just going to get reinvaded more often than not. So yeah, it's not as simple as just coming in, getting rid of something and walking away. It requires ongoing commitment, and these things are super resilient. That's why we've shifted pretty heavily towards prevention, because that's when populations are vulnerable to complete elimination. There's just a very narrow window. If you miss that window, they're super resilient and it's an ongoing problem. So yeah, it's probably not as simple as saying, yeah, I'm going to get rid of it, end of story. It's, you know, you're in for the long haul, whatever you take on, generally. There are some exceptions, of course.
And just a 30-second addition on second thoughts. I think, again, this is where these autonomous sensing technologies really come in, because demonstrating positive impacts as part of partaking in such initiatives really requires repeat monitoring of what's happening on the site, and to do this cost effectively, these new technologies will become increasingly important.
look, I can really add a little bit too from the citizen science perspective. There was a recent conference by the Australian Citizen Science Association that was hosted in Melbourne as well, and they are looking at how citizen science data, so like the data in iNaturalist, could be used to help validate reports for nature market as well. So I think there's lots of talk going on in this area about what could be done. So, well, I think that is pretty much time now that we're going to wrap it up. I just want to really thank Jens, David, and Steve for your time today and coming along and talking to everyone about your work and helping to answer their questions. So this webinar will be posted in the ALA YouTube and in our blog, and you'll be able to go there and have a recap if you want to go back over some of the things we've discussed today. Other than that, thank you everyone in the audience for coming along today, and don't hesitate to reach out to the ALA if you've got any other questions related to this area. Thank you everyone. Goodbye.